Today's quiz welcomes three friends of long standing and a newcomer to our ranks. First, we have Robert Lawrence, Associate Professor of Vocal Studies at Temple University and Artistic Director and Conductor of the Friends of French Opera. Terry McEwen, Executive Vice President and General Manager of London Records, and Richard Mohr, an independent producer who has enriched our lives with more than 70 complete operatic recordings. Our newcomer is Stephen Scovasso, who has worked with the Staten Island Operatic Ensemble and is now director of the Scovasso Opera Company. Obviously an operatic impresario in the making. Very welcome, Mr. Scovasso.
Thank you. Let me just say that everything I know about opera and a whole generation comes from listening to these Texaco broadcasts. They're just fantastic, and I have to say bravo.
Well,
just fantastic.
Thank you very much. Now, gentlemen, here's our first question, which comes from Mrs. Julia Alice of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It's a somewhat baffling question, I think. She writes, the great tenor, I'm quoting, the great tenor Enrico Caruso is reputed to have said, the requisites of a singer are a big mouth, 90% memory, 10% intelligence, lots of hard work, and something in the heart. Well, Mrs. Alice, our correspondent continues, my brother-in-law has a big heart, a big mouth, an elephant memory, intelligence of the highest, and he always works very hard, but he's still a frustrated baritone. So her question is, what else does her brother-in-law need? But Mr. Mohr?
Well, I certainly agree with Caruso's original statement, because even singers today, if they're quite frank, will say a big mouth is an absolute necessity. But the one thing she leaves out of the quotation, and so does Caruso, is she doesn't say if brother-in-law has a beautiful voice. And that is an absolute requisite. What he also would need is a sense of style, a sense of phrasing. He would need a knowledge of languages, not just learning words to an opera, but he must be able to speak the languages. And then again, he must have that indefinable something that J.M. Barrie characterized in What Every Woman Knows as charm, you know, the ability to communicate. If you have it, you don't need anything else, and if you don't have it, it doesn't much matter what else you do have.
It certainly is true. Mr. McEwen.
I think Mr. Mohr is essentially right, although I think there are lots of singers who make it today without any charm at all. And as a matter of fact, I think charm is the single characteristic most missing from music in our time, but that's a whole other discussion. But I also think many singers make it today without being able to speak any language but their own. They fake it in other languages, and you can generally hear it if you do speak a little of whatever language they're singing. But there is another quote from Caruso from another period when I believe he said to Edith Mason, my dear, it is 20% voice and 80% luck. And that's something that a singer certainly needs, which the lady's brother-in-law may not have, is a lot of luck. And in my experience, the other thing most necessary is career know-how. It's a very difficult thing to define. I'd like to write a book on it sometime. How to be successful in a career. There are people who know how to achieve success, whatever they do, and there are people who don't. And that applies to the arts as well as in any other walk of life, and I think that's terribly important.
It's an incredible one in the arts, and I'd like to read your book, Mr. Scovasso.
It's a lot of being at the right place, at the right time, at the right moment. Some people can get sick, and you just go right on. So it's a lot of that, too.
Yes. Mr. Lawrence.
I'd like to agree with and paraphrase the remark that was made before by Mr. Mohr, that in addition to the big mouth and other things, one must have a golden throat, which I think is the first requisite. And then, although all of us respect and revere the memory of Enrico Caruso, I think the times have changed, and that the idea of 10% intelligence no longer holds. We expect our singers today to be very intelligent, and to phrase intelligently, and to interpret perhaps more carefully than in previous times.
I couldn't agree with you more, but I suspect somebody come along with Caruso's voice, even without his intelligence, would still wow the audience. Mr. Mohr.
The other thing I would like to add, if Mrs. Alice's brother-in-law, I'd like to know how old he is, because if he has been frustrated for a tremendously long time, I would hope that he would give it up. No, I'm quite serious about that because I think it's heartbreaking that would-be singers can be like would-be young actors and actresses, and they keep on and on and on. They go to a succession of various vocal coaches, all of whom say, yes, this is marvelous, or you just must change this, you just must change that. And finally they end up maybe in their late 30s and they still are nowhere. They're still studying.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, after this advice, I have a question here about operatic characters giving advice. Frequently, as a matter of fact, in the form of warnings which are usually ignored, with more or less devastating results. The odd thing is that these gruesome operatic warnings are often set to the most enchantingly beautiful music. Susan Donahue of Davis, California, wants you to identify some of these warnings from listening to the music which will be played for us by Alberta Masiello of the Metropolitan Opera. After you've listened, tell us who is warning whom in what opera and what the danger is, and don't keep us in suspense about the outcome of these warnings. So, Ms. Masiello, may we have our first warning, please? Hands all up and broad grins. Mr. Scovasso.
Well, that was from Turandot by Puccini, and it's Ping, Pang, and Pong, the three counselors, and they tell the prince to just go away and just keep his head.
Yes. Right. Do you remember the exact words by any chance? You certainly nailed down the situation, yes.
I believe it's Pazzo va via.
Well, they do say that, but at this particular point they say, O scappi o il funeral per te sta preso. Get out of here or your funeral is being prepared. All right, Ms. Masiello, let's have the next warning. Fast recognition, gentlemen. Mr. Lawrence, I think maybe.
Weiche Wotan Weiche. That's Erda's warning from Rheingold, in which she warns him that his arrogance will lead to the dusk of the gods.
And does he pay attention?
Yes. As a matter of fact, he's attracted her so much momentarily that he remembers to look her up afterwards, and she bears him 9 Valkyries.
That's one outcome of the warning, I suppose. The other outcome of the warning, perhaps you could say, was the end of the ring, couldn't you?
Yes, he doesn't heed the warning, but she does make an impression.
Yes. We didn't finish what happened with Collup and the prince. Mr. Scovasso nailed down what the warning was. How does it come out, Mr. Scovasso, in the end? Does he heed the warning?
No, he doesn't, and he wins her.
Yes, so he takes his courage in his hands and was right. All right, we have a third warning, Miss Masiello. Yes, Mr. Mohr, I think.
I'm taking a slight guess. I think it's Verdi's Otello.
All right, somewhat in the style, but no, Mr. Lawrence?
Nous nous reverrons. That's in Carmen in the third act when Don José says to her, we're going to meet again. I'm leaving now, but you haven't seen the last of me.
There speaks our French opera expert. Good for you. All right, we have another. Well, let's see what pursues the result. How does she heed the warning that he's going to meet her again?
No, she didn't heed the warning, nor did she see the last of him. Because, of course, he did her in the last act.
Because she's warned again in the last act not to avoid him, and that's where she meets her doom. All right? Fourth one, Miss Masiello, if you will. Mr. McEwen?
I may have put my hand up too quickly. It sounded like Brangena. to me, but of course I've been expecting Brangäne ever since you said there was going to be a question about warnings.
Well, you were prescient and you were right.
I've also, by the way, been looking for that charming music you mentioned. Most of them haven't been that charming so far, but Brangäne certainly is. It's a beautifully feminine warning to the lovers.
To the lovers, and what is she actually warning them about?
The Liebesnacht. Einsam wachend.
Right.
Robert knows the words better than I do. She's warning them to cut it, to cut, make it quick. Because,
Mr. Scovasso?
Well, she says, Habacht, der Tag will bricht an, or something like that. She says, hurry up, the day is coming, so you better cut it out.
Yes, Mr. Lawrence?
And in that last phrase that was just played, she says, daylight comes, beware.
Yes. Habet acht, bald entweicht die Nacht. All right. Dr. Maurice E. Sherman of New York City asked our panel to defend the dramatic reputation of opera, which is sometimes peculiar, to say the least. We all know operatic characters who have been shot or stabbed to death and miraculously revived to sing long and loud dying arias, duets, or big ensembles like the finale of the Masked Ball, for example, or take Tristan, who is mortally wounded in the second act of Tristan and Isolde and needs most of the third act before he's released from his miseries. Dr. Sherman maintains that there are many operatic scenes in which singers do die with great dispatch, and he wants you to come to the rescue of opera with some good examples of speedy deaths and famous last words, if any. Mr. Mohr?
Oh, I think one of the fastest deaths is when Tosca goes over the parapet with just one line. She just says, avanti addio, O Scarpia, and bang, she's gone. Right.
That's right. I think now you have to translate those words.
Before God we will meet, O Scarpia,
Yes. Mr. Lawrence?
Another one, and I have always been fascinated by this stage direction in Gioconda, in the last act when she's been leading Barnaba on. She then, according to this direction, stabs herself and falls to the ground as if struck by lightning.
Yes, I've always been struck by that direction too. Mr. McEwen?
I think there's another death in Tosca which is just as quick as Tosca's, and that's her lover Cavaradossi, who was shot by a firing squad, falls instantly to Tosca's wonderful comment, ecco un artista.
Yes.
She thinks he's acting.
Wonderful irony. Unconscious. Mr. Scovasso?
Well, in Dialogues of the Carmelites, the nuns are they just get guillotined, and they finish singing.
Yes,
quick.
Marvelous music.
No
because
pain.
Their voices just suddenly stop at that moment. Mr. Mohr?
Another famous quick death right on the spot is Carmen. I mean, she gets stabbed and usually gives a visceral grunt, and that's the end of her.
If you even hear the visceral grunt.
Right.
Yes, Mr. Scovasso?
I might be stepping on Mr. Lawrence's toes, but one of the giants in Das Rheingold just gets clubbed over the head and he's out. Finished.
Yes. Right. Mr. McEwen?
I still think, however, if we're supposed to defend opera as theater, that a little bit of dying helps theatrically. And I think Mimi's death and Violetta's death are perhaps the most perfectly timed deaths in opera. I mean, they take a little time, and it's terribly moving and terribly exciting, but they die. They don't sing, a whole third act. Or, on the other hand, I wouldn't give up Edgardo's tomb scene. I would sometimes give up Tristan's delivery.
Well, this is not exactly on the question, but very pertinent. Mr. Lawrence?
Well, going along with Mr. McEwen on the same tack, I think that a sublime moment is in Götterdämmerung, when Siegfried has been stabbed by Hagen, and yet he revives to sing this wonderful place. He's delirious, and he thinks he's going through the fire. He relives this experience with Brünnhilde, and it's some of the greatest music in the world. And it's not too long, and it's dramatic.
Yeah, it certainly is. Mr. Scovasso?
Madame Butterfly doesn't take too long to die. She just lifts up, she throws the screen over, and she's dead. Not too long, quick.
That's very quick, yes. Mr.
Well, in
Mohr?
line with what Mr. McEwen said, too, I think a very effective death, which isn't instantaneous, is Gilda, because once Rigoletto gets her out of the sack, she has just a very short duet with her father, but it's very poignant, very arresting.
It's very arresting, but I confess that when I first listened to Rigoletto on records, I thought that it was a long time, her flight to the angels.
Really?
Depends on the conductor.
Perhaps on the singer, too. All right. This is a related question. We know all of us about heart-melting farewells, adieus, adios, lebewohls, and so on, in which two operatic characters just can't tear themselves apart, like poor Mimi in the third act of Bohème. who starts by just saying addio to her beloved Rodolfo, but they get so wound up emotionally that her addio turns into an aria, and the aria into a duet, and the duet into a quartet, and finally they decide to put it off until spring anyway. So Mrs. Virginia McKnight of New York City asks you, aren't there any operatic characters at all who just say goodbye and leave without any comment or a minimum of comment? Yes, Mr. Lawrence.
The greatest one that I know of, well, there are many great ones that comes to mind, it's not goodbye but good night, is at the end of the second act of La Fanciulla del Rest, when Jack Rance, having lost the game, the poker game, to Minnie, says in this marvelous way, as a man of honor when he's lost, "Buonanotte."
Yes.
And stalks out of the place. That's overpowering.
Yes, it's a tremendous farewell. He really has lost everything that he was interested in at the moment. Well, there are others. Yes, Mr. Mohr?
Well, it isn't too short, but I mean, at the end of the Violetta Germont duet, they exchange just a few adios, which are not too prolonged.
Yes.
And then he leaves. Right.
Yes, of course we have... beautiful sound, I'm afraid. It means for us that we have to stop because the third act of Boris Godunov is almost ready to begin. So thank you very much, Robert Lawrence, Terry McEwen, Richard Mohr, and Stephen Scovasso. This is Edward Downes inviting you to be with us again 2 weeks from today for another session of Texaco's Opera Quiz. Next week's opera, Debussy's Péléas et Mélisande, has only one intermission during which Boris Goldovsky will present a musical and dramatic analysis of that opera. To all those listeners whose questions were used on this afternoon's quiz, Texaco will send a gift package, an opera lover's dream gift package. It includes 6 complete opera recordings, all new releases, a radio, a book, and a special bonus. The radio is a Sony portable stereo FM/AM with 3 front-mounted speakers and top-mounted controls operating on battery or AC power. The 6 opera albums are, from Angel Records, Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov with Marty Talvela and Nikolai Gedda, Jerzy Semkov conducting. From Deutsche Grammophon, Verdi's Simon Boccanegra with Piero Capuccilli, Mirella Freni, Jose Carreras, Nikolai Gyaurov, Claudio Abbado conducting. From Columbia Records, Chilea's Adriana Lecouvreur with Renata Scotto, Elena Obrazova, Placido Domingo, and Cheryl Milnes with James Levine conducting. From Philips, Mozart's La Clemenza di Tito with Janet Baker, Yvonne Minton, Federica von Stade, and Stuart Burrows, Colin Davis conducting. And from London Records, Donizetti's La Favorita with Luciano Pavarotti, Fiorenza Cosotto, Gabriele Bacchier, and Nikolai Gyaurov, Richard Bunning conducting. And Verdi's Il Trovatore with Joan Sutherland, Luciano Pavarotti, Marilyn Horne, and Ingvar Wixell, Richard Bunning conducting. The book is Verdi, a documentary study by William Weaver, recently published by Thames and Hudson and hailed by the New York Times as a grand sweep of the hero's life. The special bonus I mentioned is a 1 year's membership in the Metropolitan Opera Guild, which includes a subscription to the Guild magazine Opera News. Send your questions to Texaco Opera Quiz, 135 East 42nd Street, New York, New York, 10017. I'll repeat that address in a minute, but first I must remind you that all questions sent in become the property of Texaco, and in addition, the selection by the judges of a question from among any similar questions is final. Please do not send us tapes or records. Now here's the address once again, Texaco Opera Quiz, 135 East 42nd Street, New York, New York, 10017. And now we return to Peter Allen for the story of the third act of Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov.